We got a couple big stories in the news to talk about this week. First of all, Beto's back in the news. Can't get enough of Beto lately, it seems. You wrote a nice piece about...
Two related stories.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, about him.
But you wrote a good piece about some comments he made, sort of backtracking once again on his gun stance. If you want to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, he sort of walked back his walk back, right? So back in 2019, Beto O'Rourke, during a primary debate for the Democratic nomination for president, he made some very famous comments on his desire to confiscate AR-15s and AK-47s. He said, "Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15s, your AK-47s." Very clear position. Right? This was sort of after his campaign had receded to the single digits, and he was looking for a way to jumpstart it as the primary had moved along into its later states, and it didn't work. He actually polled worse after that, and then dropped out about 2 months later. But now he's running for governor of Texas, right? And Texas is a very gun-friendly state, we'll get to a little bit in your piece on the polling that was just released there recently. And so a lot of people thought, he's going to have to backtrack on this statement to have a chance of competing against the incumbent governor, Republican Greg Abbott. But instead, he doubled down when he first announced his run for governor and said he stood by those comments back in November when he announced his campaign. And he was very adamant that, he doesn't think there should be AR-15s and AK-47s on the streets of Texas. But last week, during a campaign stop in Tyler, Texas, he changed his tune.
Right.
He told a supporter who asked him a question that he doesn't want to take anything from anybody, and that what he really wants to do is defend the Second Amendment. This seems to be a direct contradiction to his previous position, right, to anyone listening to these comments. And this made a lot of news, and we talked about it last week on the podcast. It was sort of really odd, the timing of all this and the way he went about it. And I wrote a member's piece that discussed that at length. But now, in a piece published by the New York Times, they interviewed him shortly after those comments, and he said, again, that he does not take back his stance. He isn't changing his stance on confiscating AR-15s and AK-47s. And so he's reverted once more to this position of confiscation, which is just fascinating. I don't know what to call it.
Bit of a whiplash effect.
He's completely reversed himself. Yeah, you're sort of, your head's spinning trying to follow what position Beto O'Rourke has on this issue now. And we've reached out to his campaign twice now with an attempt to get some clarification of what exactly he believes and what policy he would pursue. Like, is this a mandatory buyback situation? Right. Like what, the Vice President Kamala Harris has supported in the past, or Representative Eric Swalwell the Democrat from California. It's something he brought up during the presidential primary as well. What's going on here? And they haven't responded. His website doesn't really give a lot of additional detail either. It just says that he doesn't believe there should be AR-15s and AK-47s on the streets of Texas. So it's hard to figure out what he's doing here. It's a very confusing approach. And in fact, it sort of goes against the polling too, right? Because you wrote about a recent poll out of Texas, correct?
Sure, yeah. So even polling from last year showed he was already in a bit of a hole on gun policy. There was a 27-point spread between Abbott and O'Rourke in terms of, which is massive, huge. Massive for an issue. 60% of Texas voters said they preferred Abbott to O'Rourke on gun policy. But around the same time that he was reversing himself, I guess, this week when you wrote your piece, another poll came out from the University of Texas, where, among other things, they show that Abbott has a 10-point lead over O'Rourke, which is pretty consistent with what we've seen in other polls. But it also showed that a 7-year low amount of Texas voters support stricter gun laws, only 43%, compared to a combined total of 50% that would rather have laws stay the same or be less strict. So he's still, his position is still out of line with the Texas electorate more broadly, if these polls are accurate.
You know, that was sort of one of the reasons that we had to explain his initial reversal when he went back on the pledge to take people's ARs, because you could just look at the polling and think, oh, well, this is why he decided to reverse himself. Of course, then the question is like, why wouldn't you do that at the time you were launching your campaign? Because I think everyone assumed that these numbers would be bad for him if he kept that position. And even afterwards, you know, you obviously, I think a lot of people are just not going to believe a reversal from Beto at this point. Maybe that's why they reversed back. I don't know. Yeah, it's a strange situation, I think.
Well, you see in his most recent comments, you put him in the piece. He's sort of kind of trying to split the difference at this point, where he talks about how he still doesn't think they should have ARs and AKs on the streets, but he's just focusing on what he can do, what he thinks he can get done in Texas. So he's kind of on one hand playing, oh, these assault weapons shouldn't exist, but on the other hand, I'm not going to do anything about it because it just won't happen. So he's kind of trying to find a middle ground, but it's kind of odd to do that coming off of last week's news.
Yeah, he says, quote, I'm just telling you I'm going to focus on what I can actually do as governor and where the common ground is. And then he said, I haven't changed a thing about his position on taking AR-15s. And his strategy so far on guns seems to be attacking Greg Abbott for signing permitless carry into law last year. He calls that extremism on gun policy. And but obviously it's sort of a hard argument to make when you hold the most extreme position on gun policy in the other direction, that position that even the gun control groups have disowned. The common refrain is that nobody wants to take your guns. And so here you have a very well-known candidate saying the exact opposite thing, something that, frankly, a lot of gun rights advocates think gun control advocates actually want to do in the end, which is, take people's guns away. This is obviously the common fear among a lot of gun owners. And so, here you have Beto undermining a lot of messaging on this issue from Democrats and gun control groups. And that's probably one of the reasons you don't see them getting very heavily involved in this race, although also it's kind of a race that I think most people don't believe Beto has a chance of actually winning.
Yeah. It is funny, like, as you said, he touched the ultimate third rail on gun policy, where you actually openly say you're going to support gun confiscation. And as you pointed out, he's tried to kind of distance himself from that by going on the attack against Greg Abbott. But just to go back to that poll we talked about, that came out after constitutional carry, which, as we've talked about, typically doesn't poll very well in states for various reasons. But still, despite that being in law for 6 months, Greg Abbott still had a 27-point lead in terms of preferences on gun policy. So it's clear that at least at this point, the extremist line isn't playing well with voters. And I think they're a little more concerned, obviously, with the confiscation, it would seem.
Yeah, I mean, this just seems to be the way that's playing out, and also the way that most people would have predicted it to play out, too. The whole thing is fascinating to watch. And it'll be interesting to see if maybe he reverses himself again at some point in the future. I don't know.
Particularly during the general, primary voting is opened up. We'll see once that wraps up. He's clearly favored to be the Democratic nominee, and Greg Abbott's clearly favored to be the Republican nominee. So maybe once general season starts, we'll see some more clarity, but it'll be interesting.
Maybe. Although it feels like he's already running in the general, because there's just not really much competition in the Democratic primary. Probably because I think most Democrats don't think it's a winnable race. You saw some celebrity attention with Matthew McConaughey considering a run early on, but once that faded away, it kind of became Beto's by default. I mean, he's able to raise money for sure. I think often from both inside the state, but oftentimes a lot of money from outside the state as well. He's very popular,
Definitely,
with liberal activists nationwide, and so yeah, we'll keep an eye on the whole thing. We're going to keep people updated on what goes on with this race. But Beto's just sort of, it's hard to look at it as anything other than flailing at this point when it comes to gun policy, at least. Seems like that's going to be his weakest issue, perhaps, going into this race. And the New York Times even talked to voters at the Tyler campaign stop, where they said, that they had, at least their husband, it was one of the voters they talked to, said their husband was considering voting for Beto, except for his position on gun confiscation. So it seems like, there's anecdotal and polling evidence to suggest that position is hurting him significantly in the race. But he's, I guess, standing by it once more.